This is the second cycle on the vice presidents of the United States. We will begin by reminding you how the title came about. John Nance Garner, who was one of FDR's vice presidents in the 1930s, who was a pretty popular politician, and hopefully we will discuss him in this next cycle. He was asked, after being Speaker of the House, what do you think about being Vice President? He had a gift for words, and he said, it's not worth a bucket of warm piss. But the press could not print that. So the press had to print spit other than something else. So that's how the term entered the vocabulary of the nation. Because for a long time, the vice presidency has not been thought to be very relevant. And this was a concept that was discussed at the Constitutional Convention. You may remember that the Constitution gives the vice president very few, if any, powers and responsibilities. Really none. No powers. And only the responsibility to preside over the Senate, but vote only if the vote is tied. But that means also if the vice president cannot vote to tie a vote. Only if the vote is tied can the vice president break the tie. The vice president also will preside over the confirmation of votes following the election. Same thing that happened on January 6th. That's what the vice president was doing. Other than that, the Constitution says nothing about the vice presidents. Nothing at all. And one of the issues that I want to ask you to consider for the sake of argument, basically the same question that we posed during this last cycle. What do we expect from the vice president? What would satisfy us in the person of a vice president? What would disappoint us in the person of a vice president? Because realistically, and this is a point that we need to press home, constitutionally, the vice president has zero authority. All administrative authority has been vested on one president, that is, the president. No other person has any administrative or executive authority. In the position of vice president was really a byproduct of the Electoral College. So initially, the electors would vote for two people without specifying who did they want for president, who did they want for vice president. That was the original way of voting. Then in 1796, what happened was that John Adams got elected president and Thomas Jefferson was elected vice president. They were from different political parties and had totally different political ideologies. It was like having a Republican in one position and a Democrat in the other, or vice versa. It was totally unacceptable. Even though Jefferson was gracious, he did his job. He realized that he had very little power. He didn't try to undermine or sabotage the office of the president. He did his job and waited 4 years to become president himself. Then in 1800, Jefferson decided that he would run with Aaron Burr. as his vice presidential candidate. So the Democratic Republicans, that was the name of Jefferson's party, they went around to the electors and said, when you write down the numbers, it's Jefferson and Burr. Remember, it's Jefferson and Burr. It's Jefferson and Burr. Sure enough, so everybody went around and voted for Jefferson and Burr. So what happened? They were tied.
That's right.
They were both elected, but nobody knew who was elected president and who was elected vice president. They were just tied. The election went into the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives had to vote by states. So each state had only one vote. That's how the House elects the president in case there is a need. So a very small state has one vote in the House, and a very large state has one vote in the House. New York at that time had 30-some representatives, still had one vote. Arkansas may have had one vote and also had one vote in the House. So it took like 6 weeks to solve this problem, and multiple ballots over and over and over again, because the House of Representatives at that time was controlled by the other party, not by Jefferson's party, but by Adams' party, the Federalists. So they made themselves difficult, and it took a while to get Jefferson elected and Aaron Burr as vice president. This was corrected in 1804 by the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment basically says, instead of voting for two people, the electors will vote for one person for president and for one person for vice president. In other words, it will be an election for two offices. And that way, these problems would be avoided. On the other hand, what happened after this amendment took place was that the candidates for vice president were not of the same caliber as they had been before. What did they, what criteria, or what else was involved in the choice of a vice president? Well, they could reward a senior politician for lengthy service, somebody who had been around for 20, 25 years, who wanted a nice position in Washington and not much responsibility. Could balance the combination of candidates ideologically or geographically, one from one side and one from the other. Or they could neutralize an ambitious politician that was acceptable to the people but not to the party. That's what happened to Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was made vice president in order to have him bait himself into a corner. He was very popular with the public, he was very ambitious, but the party really did not want him. So he was made vice president, and the rest is history. We will see how securing the electoral votes from a key state was also significant. At that time, 200 and some years ago, without all these electronics, without the internet, without telephones, without television, without CNN, without Fox, people knew the people they knew. They did not know anybody from out of state. They did not know any politicians from out of state. They did not know who the governor of South Dakota was. South Dakota was not even a state at that time. So every state would tend to vote for their favorite son. To the point that when the Constitution was written, it was anticipated that many elections would be inconclusive and they would end up in the House of Representatives. That's why all those clauses were put into the Constitution, how all those elections would go into the House. So every state having a number or a particular favorite son, that state could be counted on to deliver those votes if the favorite son was on the ticket. That was the other factor. Nowadays, there are other factors. It is history that President Biden specifically said that he was going to appoint a woman of color to fill in the demographics prevalent at that time. So that's another factor to be considered. Once elected, most vice presidents were totally ignored or marginalized by the president, by the cabinet, by Congress. In other words, they would be put away to pasture. This gentleman, Richard Johnson, was vice president in the 1830s. He took the oath of office on March 4th, and the next day he left Washington. He went to, I think, Kentucky or Tennessee, and he ran a saloon and bar for about 8 months until he had to come back to Washington in December. Saloon keeper for most of the year. Why? Because he was nothing to do for him. He had no constitutional responsibilities other than the ones that were listed. Again, the Constitution is very clear that all executive authority is vested on the president and none on the vice president. The vice president that we want to talk about today is Millard Fillmore. Once I was having lunch at the club, and I met an individual that I had never met before who told me that he was a teacher, a history teacher, and that his favorite period of history in his teachings was the period before and after the Civil War. So I asked him, what is your opinion of Millard Fillmore? And he said very rapidly, oh, he was terrible. No, he was terrible. I asked him then, why do you think he was that bad? He said, well, he didn't do anything. All right, did he do anything bad? I really don't know. Did he do anything good? No, he just didn't do anything. That was the end of the conversation along that path. I did not want to pursue it anymore. So it's very obvious that Millard Fillmore has a very negative reputation as far as history, as far as the public, as far as critics, as far as the general war, except in Buffalo. In Buffalo, he is recognized as an individual. Fillmore was born in the year 1800 in upstate New York. His parents had come from New England to upstate New York and had apparently bought a farm. But the title of the farm was not good. So they lost their money and became basically tenant farmers. That is, they rented the farm, they worked the farm for subsistence. There are two things that I want you to remember particularly in order to understand certain things about Millard Fillmore. Number one, he and his family were poor. Not just poor, they were dirt poor. Very, very, very poor. At that time, there was no Social Security, there was no workman's comp, there were no other government programs available. so they barely eked out a living. So that's the first thing that I would like you to remember, that Millard Fillmore came from very humble beginnings, and his family was poor. His life was hard, very hard in the farm. They not only had to work the farm to feed themselves, but they also had to make a living, to pay rent, and if there was anything left, that was the profit. All those things were variable and subject to review. The other important thing about Fillmore is that he was self-educated. He went to school perhaps for a year, public school way in the 18 teens. He taught himself just about everything. Legend has it that he walked around with a dictionary everywhere he went. And he was constantly learning. If he had lived in Eastern this day and age, he would be here. Because he always wanted to learn something. He had that bug that forced him and drove him into learning. Throughout his life, he was very, very supportive of all things related to education. He was very, very active in the Smithsonian. He was very active at the University of Buffalo. He was very active at Buffalo General Hospital. Anything that had with education, health, and wealth. The fact that he was poor made him very interested in finance, money, the economy, government. Not that he was greedy, but that framed his orientation. He believed that government had to invest in infrastructure, what we call now infrastructure, canals, bridges, ports, signaling, signage, those things. He believed that government had to invest money, but government had to use its money very wisely. We'll get to that again. To review this, there's important things to remember. Number one, very poor. Number two, self-made or educated. Number three, interested in education. Number four, very interested in things financial, the economy, money, saving, government investment. Right? Those concepts are very, very important trying to understand this basically very good man. He was apprenticed first to a tailor and then to an attorney. At that time, there were no law schools. So an individual would apprentice with an attorney, would read the law over and over and over again. And eventually, when he was ready, he would or she would go before the bar and take the bar exam. So sure enough, Fillmore passed the bar, became an attorney, and settled in Buffalo in the 1820s. What happened in Buffalo in the 1820s?
Erie Canal.
I'm so sorry.
The Erie Canal.
The Erie Canal, absolutely. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, the Erie Canal, 1825.
Full start.
1825, no question about it. And we are separated from that period for 200 years. So it's difficult for us to understand the importance of the Erie Canal, opening up all the Midwest to navigation. Once you got the Erie Canal, you have water from Minnesota all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. The western entrance was in Buffalo. The eastern entrance was in New York. It was the Erie Canal, actually, what made New York what it is nowadays because of the traffic. So Millard Fillmore, being an attorney, a young attorney in Buffalo, having many things legal to deal with, transportation, rights, whatnot, made a law firm. And again, being very interested in finance, he made a very, very profitable practice. He built his practice in Buffalo. He married a teacher and entered politics before he was 30. As a young man, he was ambitious, intelligent, motivated, resolved to advance professionally and socially. He was in many ways a mother's ideal son because he was responsible, he worked hard, he was self-made, he moved along very, very well. He was influenced by several people that we will discuss momentarily because they were important in his education and in his upbringing. Daniel Webster, he was a legendary speaker. He was also Speaker of the House for a bit and Secretary of State, but he presented or defended about 200 cases before the Supreme Court. So the man had the gift of speech. He was also a legislator, an executive, also a dedicated unionist. He was very much for the union and opposed to slavery. He was both a colleague and a rival to Millard Fillmore because of the political positions that they occupied. Daniel Webster was certainly a legend in the Senate. Thurlow Weed was an interesting character. He was not himself a full-fledged politician, but he prided himself in being somewhat of a kingmaker. He would select promising individuals, and he would help advance their career in government. Thurlow Weed had a newspaper in Albany, New York. I think it was called the Albany Post-Dispatch or something like that, with which he promoted the individuals that he had handpicked. Thurlow belonged to the anti-Masonic Party, which then became the Whig Party when he joined with the National Republicans. What's the issue about an anti-Masonic party? In the beginning of the 19th century, right after the Napoleonic Wars, a number of secret societies developed, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, meaning the Masons, the Illuminati, remember from the Dan Brown novel, the Carbonari, the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, and those were the early revolutionaries, or what we call nowadays terrorists. The secret societies would indulge in a lot of, or a considerable amount of arson. That was their tool, arson. The Masons were particularly feared because they knew the architecture of buildings. If you know the architecture of buildings, you know all the secret passages. You know how to run away. You know the entrances. You know where they keep the food. You know where they keep the water. You know where they keep the fuel. You know who sleeps where. You know who goes where. And that knowledge that the Masons had was really very threatening to a lot of people, particularly noblemen, kings, the Pope. The Vatican really waged a lot of war against the secret societies in the first part of the 19th century. So it is not unusual that an anti-Masonic Party developed, again, to try to diffuse the effect of the Masons. Thurlow Weed generally supported Fillmore, helped him move along his career, but they certainly had their differences. It was not all 100%. For one thing, Thurlow Weed wanted to have control of all the politics in New York State. And Millard Fillmore eventually became a challenger in the politics of New York State. So Fillmore, the young man from Albany, was elected to the from Buffalo, to the state assembly in 1828. He was 28 years old, and advanced legislation against imprisonment for debt. This was very popular in the 19th century. People who were debtors go to debtors' prison. Again, Fillmore his concept of the world was basically economical. It was financial. It was money. He realized that money made the world better because he had come from nothing. He had built himself up. He was successful. So he could see that as a way of moving on, progress. He was interested in finance, economic issues, commerce, and what we now call infrastructure. And he had become prosperous in Buffalo as an attorney. He went to Washington at the age of 32. He challenged Weed for the leadership of New York State Whig Party, but lost. He clashed with Weed on economic issues. Political patronage, that was very important in the 19th century. That is, being able to put your candidates in certain specific government positions. He believed that slavery was a state, not a federal matter. And this was a very common concept at that time, that slavery was an issue that the states dealt with and that the federal government did not have any business dealing with. That was a very, very popular position in the 1830s. You remember, if you took the course on secession about the gag rules, there were a number of rules in the House of Representatives that actually did forbid the discussion of slavery in the U.S. Congress. Why? Because it was felt not to be an issue for the federal government to discuss. It was an issue left to the states. We never gave that class here, did we? The one on secession?
No.
Not yet.
No, that sounds like a good one for next winter.
Oh, but it's 8 sessions.
Well, they're going with some longer sessions now, so it's a possibility.
That's the only, now that we bring it up, yes, that's one of the issues. It's the length of class. So the USA Constitution regarding slavery did not mention slavery as such in so many words. It referred to slaves as a euphemism, persons held to labor. They were not just only slaves, they were also indentured servants and others. But generally, this is what the Constitution used to refer to slaves and the like. The Constitution acknowledged the federation. That is, for the sake of taxation and for the sake of representation, 5 slaves were considered to be the equivalent of 3 citizens. Where did that come from? The states. Many states had used that same ratio before, and it had worked well for the satisfaction of everybody. 5 slaves equal 3 white citizens. That was the federal ratio. The Constitution originally also noted the international slave trade, and it forbid Congress to eliminate the international slave trade before the year 1808. It's very clear. The Constitution was written in 1788. So for 20 years, Congress could not change anything about the international slave trade. In other words, for 20 years, Congress had to leave the international slave trade alone. And that was written into the Constitution in so many words, very, very clearly. Lastly, there was the fugitive or runaway slave clause, that if slaves were to run away from their masters and go to a state where slavery was not recognized, that slave was supposed to be returned to their master. In other words, it's almost as if your car is stolen and is found somewhere in Delaware. We're supposed to bring it back, or you're supposed to get it back. It's still your property. So that's the same general idea, recognizing that unofficially slaves were property. But the U.S. Constitution never said that in so many words. The U.S. Constitution never stated that slaves were property. In 1861, and again, this is from the course on secession, when we studied the Confederate Constitution. The Confederate Constitution stated not once, not twice, not three times, but 4 times, that slaves were property. That's how important that was to the Southern economy. But the original U.S. Constitution was not explicit. The Fifth Amendment guaranteed due process, and the 10th Amendment noted that powers not delegated to the United States or prohibited to the states were reserved to the states or to the people, which is something that has been invoked in our present day and age. The recent discussion and decision of the Supreme Court regarding abortion is based on the 10th Amendment. And if the Constitution says the federal government cannot do it, the states are not prohibited, therefore this goes to the states. This is the state's choice. Yes, please.
How does that tie in with the Fugitive Slave Act? It came later, I guess. But they would still, I mean, it doesn't seem like it was a change from what was already there.
Dave, good question. Thank you for bringing it up. The Fugitive Slave Clause is in the original Constitution. It was supported by a law, I think, in 1792 from the federal government. And then there was the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850 that we will refer to in a moment. Thank you, but we're coming to that. In other words, the Constitution is there. The legislature creates laws around the Constitution to reinforce the Constitution. But the Fugitive Slave Clause is in the original Constitution. So the 10th Amendment is still very, very much in vogue, as it is held to be very relevant to our way of life and to the concept of federalism. Henry Clay was another individual that was very influential on Millard Fillmore. Henry Clay was the leader of the Whig Party, and he was an advocate of the American system. The American system held that the wealth of America and the union of the states would be preserved through 4 things. Number one, and they were mostly economic. Number one, there was the tariff, that is the taxes that are applied to goods as they come in from outside. Like not a few years ago, there was a new tariff on white wine from France. That was like 15, 20%, 25%. And that is used to discourage the purchase of those things coming from outside and encourage the utilization of cheaper products made in the States. So there are tariffs on steel, there are tariffs on rubber, there are tariffs on cotton, there are tariffs on leather, there are tariffs on many things. But you get the idea. You put a tax on something to discourage its use and encourage the use of domestic products. The second thing of the American system was the national bank. Henry Clay was in favor of the national bank. That was the idea of Alexander Hamilton. Remember Alexander Hamilton, the one with the musical? It was him. Without the national bank, we would not have Hamilton the musical. Can you imagine what a shame it would be? So, but take a moment here, even though it doesn't have to do that much with the vice presidency, to imagine the conflict between a national bank chartered by Congress in Washington, chartered to be able to work in different states, and a state bank chartered by a local legislature, empowered to deal with business locally, but not outside the state. So there was the conflict between the federal government and the states was also transposed or extended into the banking system. The National Bank, the Bank of the United States, the first and second bank of the United States, was always in conflict with the state banks because they operated under totally different laws. The federal government would take its enormous funds and put them into the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States, by the way, was also private. That is, individuals like you and me, we could buy shares in the Bank of the United States and still receive all the privileges of having all those deposits from the federal government. Of course, the smaller banks would feel kind of slighted that they did not have the opportunity to gain access to all those funds. So that's one more conflict. Certainly, Henry Clay was in favor of the bank. The federal government at that time owned a lot of land, an enormous amount of land. All those territories that we talk about, the Louisiana territory, for example, it's all federal land. And that land could be sold in parcels to different individuals at great profit. Henry Clay believed that there should be a premium on land sales for the government to make money on the sale of lands. And finally, also infrastructure. The government had a responsibility to invest in primarily ways or means of transportation, bridges, roads, canals, ports. Who would benefit from those things? Take a moment to think about it. Who would benefit from those things? Merchants. Merchants? And what part of the country would benefit the most? The coast and the north. The southern states did not benefit much from infrastructure. The northern states benefited from infrastructure improvements. So there was, again, a conflict. People in Louisiana and Alabama would say, why should I give money to the federal government for them to build the Erie Canal or the Erie Railroad or ports and bridges in New England. Why? Well, that's federation. So there was, throughout the early part of the 19th century, there was a lot of conflict about that. And actually, in the Confederate Constitution, investment by the federal government, by the Confederate government in infrastructure was prohibited. That was one of the other differences between the Confederate Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. Therefore, Henry Clay believed that the economic bonds of commerce and trade would preserve the Union. And this concept was instrumental in the development of the philosophy of Millard Fillmore. Keep everybody prosperous. Keep the southern states prosperous. Keep the northern states prosperous. Understand that they have to depend on each other. And this will keep the Union together and will keep us at peace. Henry Clay himself had numerous legislative positions. He ran for president once. Obviously, he didn't make it, but he was a great American. The other individual that had a lot of influence on Millard Fillmore was William Seward. Seward was also a protege of Thurlow Weed. He was one of those individuals that Thurlow tried to move along. He was governor of New York, 2 elections, and appointed to the Senate in 1849. Just to refresh your memory, senators only became elected after 1910. Up until then, senators were appointed by the state legislature, but they only became elected after 1810. Seward was very much an abolitionist. He did want to get rid of slavery altogether. When he was governor, he refused to extradite several fugitive slaves. And he sent the message very clearly: we do not consider human beings to be property in New York State. With that, more or less, he ruled himself out of the presidency forever, because he made himself totally unacceptable to the southern states and suspicious to the border states. That made him too radical. He was considered to be hostile to slavery and to the southern states. But nevertheless, he was a very, very important politician. He was Lincoln's runner-up in the 1860 convention. If it had not been for Lincoln, Seward would have been the nominee of the Republican Party in 1860. So he was a very important person at that time. Not only that, he also became Lincoln's Secretary of State. And he held that position under Lincoln and under Johnson. And he was the individual that negotiated the sale of Alaska from Russia. So he was a very, very important politician and a very, very dedicated American. Going back to Fillmore, now that we analyzed his background, and again, the background emphasizes education and emphasizes economics and prosperity. Fillmore was elected to the House of Representatives in 1833 and again in 1837. He was runner-up for Speaker of the House. Therefore, Millard Fillmore in the 1830s was recognized nationally as a leader, as a politician, as a good person who was able to run for Speaker of the House. So he was just nobody. No, he was not nobody. He was appointed chairman of the Ways and Means Committee of the House of Representatives. What does that committee do? Money, finance, commerce, anything liquid. That's what that committee does. So he was at that time recognized as a major individual in the economic life of the nation. He was just he was not a nobody. He was recognized as an expert and was instrumental in drafting the tariff law of 1842. So he had a background. He was not a man who came from nothing. He was nominated for governor, but lost the election. But shortly thereafter, the office of comptroller, basically treasurer of New York, became an elected office rather than an appointed office. He ran for comptroller and won by a tremendous margin. He was really recognized as a person very well versed and able in things economical. Again, that was his orientation. In 1848, he was nominated for vice president with General Zachary Taylor by the Whig Party. The question is, why was Millard Fillmore considered a nobody except by the insiders who knew him? Why was nominated for vice president? Well, for one thing, he would accept the nomination. Reportedly, the nomination went out to 6 other people who said, no, not me, no thank you, get somebody else. No, not me. No, I don't want to be vice president. That's fine. Thank you. Nice of you to think about it. But so he accepted the position of vice presidential candidate. He was a vote getter, particularly after the election for comptroller. So he could deliver New York's 36 electoral votes. He had a definite track record in Congress. He was recognized as a learned man, an able man, a good politician. He was free of scandal. He had no extreme positions. He was not like Seward, who said, look, we don't trade in human property. He did not have that attitude. He said, I'm not for slavery, but I recognize that slavery is a fact of life where it exists. Basically the same point of view that Lincoln had. He was less objectionable than Seward. And again, this idea of balancing the ticket. Taylor was a slave owner from a border state, and Fillmore was a moderate northerner. In other words, one balanced the other in the opinion of the public. This was the result of the election of 1848. Taylor and Fillmore won 47% of the vote, while the Democratic Party, Cass and Butler, 43% of the vote. Electoral votes, 163 to 127. What's the difference? Quick, without using your iPhone.
25 degrees.
Yeah, about 36, right?
I'm just there.
How many electoral votes did it require?
How many electoral votes from New York?
36.
36. So that made the difference. That was the difference. Millard Fillmore allowed the Whigs to win the election by tipping New York State towards the Whigs. See how there is really not much difference north and south. There are states that go Whigs and there are states that go Democratic, both in the north and in the south. The point of this slide is to point out that it was New York's 36 electoral votes that made General Taylor and Millard Fillmore victorious in the election. Again, and this was predicted, once the election was finished, the vice president was totally ignored and marginalized. And this is what happened throughout most of the 19th century. He could not influence appointments. He could not exercise patronage. That is, he could not bring in his people to specific government positions. On the other hand, there was a lot of unhappiness with President Taylor, who did not push for the expansion of slavery. Remember, Taylor was a slaveholder himself. He had actually quite a number of slaves, but he did not favor legislation or programs that would allow for the expansion of slavery or states' rights. As far as those things were concerned, Taylor was more of a disappointment than anything. As vice president, Fillmore presided over the Senate in the great debates of 1849 and 1850. And these are readily available on the internet. These are very, very eloquent, very, very well written, and easy to understand speeches. The issues were many: the Mexican cession, the assimilation of Texas, the Wilmot Proviso, the controversy between popular and congressional sovereignty in the territories, which resulted in the Compromise of 1850. The Wilmot Proviso is of great interest to one and all. It was a rider attached to a spending bill that was introduced the night before Congress was going to adjourn. So it was, the White House sent this bill for $2 million in appropriations, saying, let's just get this through in the middle of the night. Let's not discuss it. Let's not have public discussion. Let's not have public views. And in the discussion, David Wilmot, which was a Democrat, not a Whig, a Democrat, from Pennsylvania, rose his hand and was acknowledged for, I think, 2 minutes. Give this guy 2 minutes to say something. So Wilmot gets up in the House of Representatives and proposes a rider to the law saying that in any and all territory acquired from Mexico during the Mexican War, slavery will be forbidden. Big bomb. Why he even brought up the word slavery? Slavery as a word was a no-no in Congress. It was a subject not to be discussed. So this introduction of the concept was explosive because it brought it to the forefront. This was a concept that was going to be discussed and argued and considered by all parties. The Wilmot Proviso was approved by the House that night, but it never got to the Senate. The next year it was presented again, it was approved by the House, sent to the Senate, and it died in committee. The Wilmot Proviso never became law. They tried to make it part of the peace treaty with Mexico, but it was also rejected. It was the most important rider or amendment or clause that never became law. But it affected the conversation, the discussion, the issues for years and years and years. At this time, probably in part due to the introduction of the Wilmot Proviso, a crisis developed. We think that the states seceded from the Union in 1860. It all began way before. But it was in 1850, 10 years before the actual secession, that the real trouble began. The proviso introduced by Roma, sure, it had some moral and humanitarian aspects to it, but it was basically an economical issue because the northern states did not want to compete with slave economy in the new territories. And they made no bones about it. This was the issue behind the Wilmot Proviso. It never became law, but it really dominated the debate. How far did the debate go? My God. The southern states convened a convention in Nashville to discuss the Wilmot Proviso and to discuss secession in 1850. Cooler heads prevailed, though, and secession was not voted in. But the real crisis began in 1850 with the introduction of the Wilmot Proviso and the problem what to do with the territories obtained from Mexico. Finally, the Compromise of 1850 was arrived at. It was originally introduced as an omnibus bill. An omnibus bill is a bill that contains a number of bills set that have nothing to do one with the other, so that the whole thing is just moved along. That's the whole idea of an omnibus bill. That failed in Congress. So a number of smart politicians said, look, there's something in this for everyone. Let's see. These states over here, they would like to have, look, if you vote for this first section of the compromise, we'll assure you votes for this other one. Deal, okay? If you vote with us, we'll get other votes to vote for you. Deal. So 5 different bills were introduced, and different majorities were built in order to get through the Compromise of 1850. Compromise of 1850 provided for the admission of California as a free state. Number one. What's the big problem? A lot of California lies below the 3630 line, which was supposed to be the demarcation of slavery between North and South. That was the first issue. Number 2, New Mexico and Utah were admitted as territories, not states, yes, as territories, using the popular sovereignty clause. Popular sovereignty meant that the people who lived in those territories could decide whether they wanted slavery or no slavery at the time they entered the Union as a state. You say, well, that's democratic. That sounds pretty reasonable. Well, if the people can decide, what can Congress do? Congress does not want to give up that privilege of deciding whether they want or not. So that necessarily created a lot of friction. Texas, oh my goodness, we'll get to that in a second. Texas wanted a whole bunch of land here and had already sent troops into that land. Yes, please.
Before you go on, why did they say California could be a free state? Why was that nobody cared about?
Probably because the South realized that they had to give in order to get something.
Okay.
Compromise.
Okay,
Good question, thank you. The other thing was that there were not that many slaves in California to begin with. But as far as agriculture was concerned, California would have made a new slaves. So the Texas wanted a lot of land from the adjoining territories and had sent troops in there to defend that land. On the other hand, Texas had an enormous amount of debt, about $10 million at that time. $10 million at that time was a lot. The deal was the federal government said, look, Texas, let's reach a deal about these territories and we'll take your debt. In other words, we will assume responsibility for your debt. And Texas said, deal, you got it. That was the third part of the compromise of 1850. The fourth part was slavery in the District of Columbia. Slavery was allowed, but there was no slave trade in the District of Columbia. Big concession, isn't it? You don't want to hear the district? Go upstate to Maryland, down to Maryland, or go to Alexandria and sell your slaves there. So that was really a minor concession. The big concession was the fugitive slave law. The southern states, particularly Georgia also held a convention in 1850 to address these issues, and it issued a statement which is very, very short, but quite learned and very, very interesting in the sense that it really extends a hand to the northern states. Come meet us halfway. We don't want to split. We want to stay in the union. We want good things to happen to everybody. But the one thing that we really need is a strong fugitive slave law. That was the thing that mattered the most for the southern states, the fugitive slave law. So being a vice president at that time, Fillmore presided over the Senate debates. He believed that commerce and prosperity would hold the Union together. He was in favor of the compromise. There's 5 different bills, because that would keep the Union together. But Taylor and the cabinet, these are the gentlemen of the cabinet, were against the compromise. To the point that Fillmore went to the president and said, Mr. President, you know, I'm presiding over the Senate, and if the vote is tied, I get to cast a deciding vote. I'm going to vote for the compromise if that situation comes up. Even if you are against it, I am going to vote for it. Again, Fillmore was looking at preserving the peace, maintaining the government, maintaining commerce, prosperity for everybody. Prosperity would keep the Union together. Well, he didn't have to take the vote because the good old president on the 4th of July had, according to historians, cucumbers in milk. And he got sick from it and died of gastroenteritis. From cucumbers and milk.
Yes.
Judging from what happened, you know, at that time, medical knowledge was very limited. But trying to put things together, how it took him like 10 days to get sick and die, probably the president had an attack of gallstones. and got impacted with a gallstone, developed pancreatitis, and that's how he died. So he did not die of really of gastroenteritis as we recognize that nowadays, but it was probably biliary stones. So Millard Fillmore became president when the president died dead. But he had absolutely no plans to become president. He had never even thought of the idea of becoming president. He did not have a staff. He did not have a residence in Washington. He had an office in the Senate, but that's about it. He had states threatening to secede over the Wilmot Proviso. Legislators were engaged in fistfights. They were carrying firearms. This was a big crisis. In the middle of this crisis, the president dies, and a man who does not want to be president becomes president. Pretty challenging, I'd say. Well, as is the custom when a president or executive dies, all the individuals that have been appointed submit their resignations. That's standard practice. Knowing that in most cases, the president or the new executive will say, no, don't resign, just stay at your post, support what I'm doing, we'll work together. And that's what I expected. One by one, all the members of the cabinet marched into Fillmore's office, handed the resignation. And Fillmore took the resignation, shook their hand. Thank you very much. You're discharged. Next. Thank you very much. You're discharged. Thank you for your service. Goodbye. See you again someplace else. He accepted the resignation of the whole cabinet. The whole cabinet was discharged immediately. He made new appointments, including Webster, that we talked about, Crittenden and Thomas Corwin, that would surface again during the secession crisis. But he was really chastised. He was called childish in the press, petulant, insecure, and vindictive. Uninformed, ignorant, impulsive, arbitrary. Sounds like divorce papers. Which eventually it was the whole idea of separation and worse. Now, was he all these things? The cabinet was not his cabinet. He had never been consulted about the cabinet. Not only that, the cabinet was against the compromise of 1850, and the cabinet was hostile to him. The cabinet was not a friendly cabinet. Who would want to work with a cabinet like that? Who would? No way. You don't want to work with people that are going to be against the principles that you want to advance. Fillmore demonstrated by discharging the cabinet and assuming the branch of government by himself that he was capable of handling the crisis on short notice. He knew that violence and disunion were likely unless the compromise was reached, and he was correct there. The Civil War would be devastating to the economies of both the North and the South, and should be avoided at all costs. That was his orientation. Keep the Union together through the economic benefits for both sides. So therefore, he signed the several bills that made the Compromise of 1850. And the Fugitive Slave Act, he signed very, very reluctantly. In fact, he got the bill, he put it down on his desk, he waited 4 days, he asked the Attorney General, take a look at this bill. Tell me what to do. I don't like it one bit, but it may be necessary just to save the peace. I dislike it, I dislike it, I dislike it, but I have to put the benefit of the nation before my personal likes and dislikes. Again, that was his orientation. So the Fugitive Slave Act was authored by James Mason of Virginia. And these are some of the highlights of the Fugitive Slave Act. As far as fugitive runaway slaves, officials who did not arrest a slave could be penalized up to $1,000 at that time, probably $25,000 at this time, just for not trying. Just for not trying. So it was compulsory for officials to try to apprehend them. Civilians could be recruited. That is, the agents could go away and advertise, we need people to chase down this fugitive, and recruit civilians and pay them a stipend for their work. An arrest could be made on just a claimant's testimony, and there was no habeas corpus. The absence of habeas corpus allows the government to take somebody into custody without charges. And that happened throughout the Civil War. That is imprisonment without charges. That's one of the benefits of habeas corpus. So that was forbidden when the fugitive slave. It's more, a hearing would take place before a commissioner, not before a judge. There was no jury. It was just a commissioner. The fugitive could not testify on his behalf. He could not even say, hey, I'm not the person you're looking for. How unjust this was. How very, very, very unjust. Now, if the commissioner found the fugitive was true, he would get $10 and $5 if the fugitive was released. So there was an incentive for the judge to find the fugitive as the person to be deported. Aiding a fugitive could result in a fine of $1,000 and jail. That's the risks that the people in the Underground Railroad took. So the Fugitive Slave Act was considered very, very negatively in the northern states. They hated it. They hated it with a passion. Fillmore himself believed that slavery was evil, but it was his responsibility to enforce all the laws, not just some, not those he wanted, not just the ones he liked, not just the ones that he favored, but all the laws had to be enforced, even if he did not like it. That was his opinion, that was his belief. So he supported the fugitive slave law to maintain peace, to prevent disunion, and to prevent conflict. For that reason, he was tolerated in the South, but he was really chastised in the North. And this may be one of the reasons why he is such unpopular at this time and has been in the last few years. To talk about other things in his administration, he had what we call nowadays a low-key approach to government. If it was not present, he would probably not show up very often on television. He would not make many speeches. He would let others handle the things, and he would just manipulate things behind curtains. So he had a very low-profile attitude towards government. As far as Texas was concerned, Texas claimed territories here in New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, this is what Colorado, Wyoming, Texas believes all those territories belonged to Texas, and they had sent troops there. So Fillmore sent a letter to the governor of Texas, and the letter basically said, back down. Back down. We don't need this. Back down. They did. They accepted the debt, and the Panhandle went to Oklahoma. This went to New Mexico, Colorado, and so forth. So he diffused that crisis very, very easily without a lot of fanfare. He appointed Brigham Young, governor of Utah. He nominated Curtis to the Supreme Court, and Curtis was the one that in the Dred Scott case provided or wrote the dissenting opinion, which was very, very, very powerful. Curtis was a kind of difficult man to get along with, but he was certainly brilliant. At the same time, France was trying to get a hold of parts of Hawaii. Hawaii was not part of the United States at that time, but France wanted to get in there. Again, through diplomacy, the administration of Millard Fillmore told France, we can all live very happily, particularly if you don't. And they did. So his achievements so far are, again, considerable, but not very well publicized. He sponsored a lot of improvements, including the Transcontinental Railroad, canals in Michigan, the Illinois Central Railroad that ran from Chicago all the way up to Alabama, the Erie Railroad that generally paralleled the Erie Canal. And he also advanced the idea of a canal through Nicaragua to the Pacific Ocean that would take another 50 years to build. But he initiated that idea. Similarly, we all know about the Perry expedition to Japan that opened up the Far East to commerce. He settled the issue of the Guano Islands with the Portuguese. And he also dealt with the crisis over Lopez execution. Narciso Lopez, this character here, was kind of a very aggressive individual that organized 2 military expeditions to Cuba. And the idea was to take over the government of Cuba from the Spanish government and turn Cuba into a slave state. This is nothing new. The United States had wanted Cuba for a long time. And even Buchanan, during the Buchanan administration, gave orders to a number of ambassadors to do what is necessary to acquire Cuba. The United States, throughout the mid-1850s, lusted for Cuba quite a bit. At the same time, Germany also wanted Puerto Rico, but that usually doesn't make it into the history books. Anyway, Narciso Lopez, it's really Lopez, but in English we say Lopez, organized these invasions into Cuba. The first one went nowhere. The second one failed, but he was captured. He was put to justice and executed by the Spanish government in Cuba, which created a big crisis. There were riots in New Orleans. History books say that the United States and Spain almost went to war over this in the early 1850s, but the administration of Millard Fillmore quieted things down through diplomacy, and nothing happened. So he avoided, again, his administration avoided a civil war with Spain. not a civil war, an international war in Spain. He decided not to run in 1852 because he was very unpopular in the North. He was very unpopular in the South. He knew he was not going to make it anywhere, so he decided not to run. Franklin Pierce, who was from New England, was inaugurated in 1853, and on March 4th, Millard Fillmore and his family left the White House. His wife, Abigail, died of pneumonia that same month. Within a few more months, his daughter, Mary, died of cholera. So he had very little property, no pension. At that time, the presidents had no pension. So having lost his daughter and his wife, he went back to Buffalo to practice law. He did not join a political party, but remained visible. He joined the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, which was one of the secret societies. He warned against immigrant influence in elections. Does that sound familiar? That issue is still active. Should immigrants be able to vote? So even in the 1850s, it was a big issue. He traveled to Europe and the Middle East, met royalty and Pope Pius IX. The accounts of his visits in Europe are very interesting because the Europeans were really fascinated that this man who had been born in poverty, who had literally no formal education, he could sit down and converse with kings and the Pope and noblemen, and he was so knowledgeable about all the issues that they wanted to consider. So the Europeans were very, very impressed with Millard Fillmore, and the Queen of England thought that he was the most handsome man she had ever seen. While he was in Europe, and without his consent, he was nominated for president by the American Party. Fillmore was a solid unionist. He really believed in the Union, and he felt that slavery was a state's matter, largely the same thing that Lincoln said. He warned that the election of any Republican would split the Union and lead to war. So without campaigning, in the election of 1856, he drew 22% of the vote. 8 electoral votes, all in Maryland. And that was it. But still, 22% of the vote. Yes.
Another name for the American Party is the Know Nothing Party. And
I'm sorry.
another name for the American Party is the Know Nothing Party. And the governor of Maryland was a Know Nothing. So Maryland has a very interesting history.
Absolutely, absolutely. We get into that on the, in the course of secession.
Sure.
Thank you very much. He went back to Buffalo, he remarried, and he supported generally the Buffalo General Hospital, the Fine Arts Academy, and was chancellor of the University of Buffalo for all of his life. In 1860, he voted for Stephen Douglas. He was critical of Buchanan's inaction. He believed that the federal government could not coerce or force a state to remain in the Union. Never supported slavery, but recognized its importance to the economy of the South. He joined a Home Guards unit during the Civil War. He thought Lincoln was too hesitant to attack in the South and called for magnanimity towards the South at the end of the war. Voted for McClellan, and he died of a stroke in 1874. His legacy is tainted because of the support of the fugitive slave law. Criticism of Lincoln's conduct of the war which everybody engaged in. Everybody was very, very critical of Lincoln during the war. Advocacy of rapid Reconstruction, and being willing to tolerate slavery to preserve the Union. So the things that motivated Millard Fillmore were basically economic. Politically, he thought slavery was an issue to be decided by the states. Personally, he was against slavery, but he did not feel the government had the power to control slavery. It's unlikely that in the future his opinion or his perception will be improved or will be altered, because there are really no major breakthrough disclosures that are going to enhance his popularity. He was against he was in favor of the Fugitive Slave Act, which made him extremely unpopular in the North. And that's enough to cloud his legacy. That's all we have to say about Millard Fillmore. Yes, please.
Overall, how would you rate his performance both as a vice president and a president?
Vice presidency, wise, he could not do much. The vice president is just really can't do much. As president, he was very courageous in taking on government on short notice and appointing a new government. He had some achievements, but it was a lose-lose proposition as far as the Fugitive Slave Act. He either signed it and accepted slavery, or he didn't sign it and probably saved civil war and secession. We have to look at these characters according to their time. What would we have done? What would a reasonable person have done in the circumstances? Very difficult to tell.
So you feel the Civil War would have started 20 years earlier?
At least secession would have occurred. They were ready, the southern states were ready to secede. And he was able to initiate the process by which peace was saved for 10 years. So he saved the peace for 10 years. One thing for sure is that secession did not occur until a Republican president was elected. And that was Lincoln. If any of the others had been elected, secession would not have occurred then. May have occurred later, but may not have occurred then. We have to consider people according to their place in history. And at that time, it was really a major crisis. And as an executive, he was able to diffuse the crisis. He had to accept the terms that he was given. Not an easy choice, not an easy solution. But those were the choices that he was given. What else could he have done? Risk war, risk secession, risk disunion. Remember that we are looking at these things from our focus today. We have to transport ourselves 170 years in the past and try to see things as they were. One of these questions that really does not have a good answer. But our responsibility is to try to give you the facts so that you can reach your own conclusions. Thanks very much.
This is very interesting. Yeah.
Next week, we will talk about John C. Breckinridge and Hannibal Hamlin, the two vice presidents of the 1850s. Thank you very much for coming in.